Welcome to part 3 in this series exploring technique for improvising on the violin. If you haven't watched part 1 or 2, I suggest you go back and watch them first. Audiation is the verb to music. It was invented by renowned music education researcher Edwin Gordon in 1975, who explained that audiation is to music what thought is to language. When musicians talk about aural skills, aural imagination, prehearing, or hearing music in your inner ear, they're talking about audiation. What differentiates audiating from playing an instrument is that it happens in your head, without the need for an instrument or voice to make the sounds first. For instance, Mozart could audiate an entire symphony clearly enough to transcribe it without the aid of a piano or other instrument. When playing folk music or jazz, rather than memorizing music visually or mechanistically, the sound of the music is internalised by audiating it, and then externalised onto the instrument in performance. Classical violin training, however, uses a very different process to learn music, based on visual learning and memorising physical movements and shapes. Here are some quotes from Gordon's research that clarify the difference between reading and audiating music. We may read or write notation without audiating sounds it represents. In that case, we are simply decoding symbols and not audiating music. For instrumentalists who do not audiate, symbols unfortunately represent only fingerings. Memorizing on a music instrument is commonly related to fingerings and other technical matters, not to audiation. It is as if they were reciting words they memorized without ascribing meaning to the ideas the words represent. Unfortunately, many persons with lofty music aptitudes have learnt to imitate and memorize very well, but have not learnt to audiate. If you need notation to remember how a piece of music goes, you haven't learnt to audiate it. If you can't transpose it, you haven't learnt to audiate it. If you can't improvise your fingerings, you haven't learnt to audiate it. If you can't sing it, you haven't learnt to audiate it. If you can't close your eyes and hear the whole piece in your head, you haven't learnt to audiate it. Instead, you're relying on external, visual, and mechanical cues to make the sounds that create the piece. Imagine you ask 2 volunteers to read a book. The first person sees the words, hears the sound of the words in their head, understands their meaning, and speaks them out loud. The second person inserts the book into a machine and flips switches and turns levers until the machine speaks the words of the book. You confiscate the machine, but now they can't read the book because they've only ever used the machine to read with. They can't hear the sounds of the words in their head or understand their meaning. They could memorize the words, phrasing, and articulation of the first volunteer by copying them enough times, but they still wouldn't understand the meaning of what they were saying. There is a significant difference between audiating and monitoring what you are playing on your instrument. Monitoring is an auditory feedback loop that helps to direct the playing in response to what is being played. For example, when you adjust your intonation, tone, or phrasing while performing or practicing, and is an essential and highly developed skill in classical music performance and practice. Audiating, however, is hearing what has not yet been played, meaning what you play is in response to what you audiate. Monitoring is a reaction in the moment, whereas audiation is the action of pre-hearing in advance what you will play. Audiation and monitoring can happen together, but monitoring can also happen without audiation. And late in life when deaf, Beethoven famously audiated the music he composed without ever being able to monitor it externally. In jazz and folk music, learning to audiate is a core skill comparable in importance to sight reading for a classical musician, as these are the primary ways that music is learned and reproduced. But what's actually happening within audiation? While researching for my PhD, I asked some of my favourite improvising fiddle players what they hear when improvising, and their responses fell into 3 broad categories. These were harmony, language, and emotion or inner voice. Hearing harmony begins with being able to hear the sound of 2 notes, called an interval, in your head. By hearing multiple intervals at once, you can hear a chord. This progresses to hearing two chords simultaneously, how they interact, progress, and voice lead, and extends to hearing full progressions. Another way harmonic audiation skills are built is by first hearing the bass line of a progression or piece, and then learning to hear the qualities and extensions of each chord built up from that bass line. Hearing harmony is a skill applicable to any style of music and is the basis of audiation. Hearing intervals and note durations in your head is the most fundamental way you can do music. Hearing language is a concept more easily experienced by anyone. Just pause this video and let your mind wander for a few minutes. You have learnt a large number of words, attached meaning to those words and phrases, and have practiced using these words and meanings to communicate ideas with others. You can mix and match words creatively to say things you've never said or thought before. This doesn't mean you can speak freely in any language, only those you are fluent in. Unlike hearing harmony, hearing language is specific to the style of music you want to play. A language includes progressions, melodies, riffs and licks, chord colours, chord scale relationships, and more. You become fluent in it by studying grammar, listening to the fluent speakers, learning from their sophisticated, nuanced, and creative use of the language, and practicing speaking it yourself until you become fluent. Hearing your inner voice, or the emotional content of what you're playing, is the most personal part of audiation. Hearing harmony is a technical skill you can learn, and language is a tool you can use to organize that harmony into a landscape that other people can recognize. What you have to say within that landscape is where audiation connects with the emotional intent of the performer. It's hard to express your thoughts and feelings with only a few words, so the more language you have available, the easier it is to accurately communicate them. If you know the harmonic landscape well enough, you don't have to watch your step as you follow your inner voice. But what does all this have to do with technique and improvisation on the violin? Can't classically trained violinists just download an ear training app, learn some jazz language, and start improvising? Classical violinists typically learn visually and memorize physically. This means our ingrained, instinctual approach to learning to improvise is to externalize the harmony and language by memorizing scales, progressions, chords, licks, and riffs on the fingerboard. This physical approach to learning music can be so hardwired that it acts as a barrier to experiencing the feeling of audiating music first, and only then attaching a physical response to it. In fact, our technical ability to play the violin relies on our rote-learnt, mechanistic approaches to locating and navigating on the fingerboard. This means that whenever we feel insecure, unstable, lost, or under stress, we instinctively increase our focus on the mechanics of what we are playing and where we are on the fingerboard. At every turn, when we struggle to hear harmony by audiating, our subconscious, fear-based response triggers the recall of thousands of hours of rote-learnt, mechanical training to regain a feeling of security. This locks our focus back onto the fingerboard and the positions and fingering schemas that provide the foundation of our technique. How we learned dictates how we think and play, and if we try to overcome these constraints, we risk losing our ability to play at all. Alongside specific jazz training, fiddlers and violinists who want to improvise are often advised to either have or gain a good technique, and most players will look to classical technique to provide this. However, this is fundamentally problematic if key parts of that technique directly undermine and inhibit the development of core skills needed to improvise well. So how can we build technique in a way that works with rather than against the goals of improvising? How can we effortlessly perform the freely created melodies we hear when audiating? Connection, part 4 in this series, provides these answers.